The Whitmore Charity Gala opened on the first cold evening of October, and into a ballroom blazing with diamonds walked a duchess who wore none. Eleanor came through the great doors of Carrington House with her hands bare to the wrist and her throat unadorned, a single fold of gray silk over a gown the color of river stone, and 300 candles found nothing on her to catch. The room understood the absence at once. A duchess without jewels was a confession, and the confession traveled the length of the hall faster than she could cross it. Lady Brixham, seated near the orchestra with her fan held a half-inch too high, leaned toward the woman beside her, and said, in the carrying half-whisper that is meant to be heard, that the poor creature had nothing left to pin to herself. Eleanor heard it. She kept walking. At the far end of the room, beneath the cold winter glass of the tall windows, a man stood apart from the dancing with his back half to the crowd. And when she entered, he went still in the particular way a person goes still, when something they have decided not to want has just walked into the room. He did not move toward her, he did not look away, either. What none of them knew, watching her come empty-handed through that glittering door, was that she had not lost the jewels. She had given them away, and the place she had given them would have stopped every fan in that room. Stay with me for this one. You are about to watch a room decide it knows a woman, and then learn, slowly and in front of everyone, how wrong it was. Now back to that cold October evening. To understand why a duchess arrived at the season's most watched gala, wearing nothing but gray silk, you must understand what the year had taken from her. Her husband, the Duke of Aldermere, had been dead 11 months. He had died as he had lived, quietly and without fuss, of a fever that took him in 4 days, and he had left her a house she loved, a title she had never wanted, and a nephew who wanted both. The nephew was Mr. Doggett, Crispin Vane, a young man of excellent tailoring and modest income, and within a fortnight of the funeral he had begun to speak of the estate as though it were already drafting itself toward his hands. The law was not entirely on his side, but the law was not entirely against him either. And in the gap between those two truths he had built a campaign of small daily pressures. There were solicitors, there were letters. There was, above all, the steady suggestion carried through the drawing rooms of the county that the widow was not managing, that a woman alone could not hold so large a thing, that it would be kinder to everyone if she simply gave way. He called at the house with documents she had not asked to see, and spoke of dust sheets and reduced staff, and the sad impossibility of a young widow rattling alone about so many rooms, and each visit left behind it a residue of suggestion that the servants felt and the county repeated. He never threatened. He was far too careful to threaten. He merely arranged the facts so that her continued possession of her own home appeared. In his telling a small daily act of selfishness against a deserving young man, and he had a gift for telling it to exactly the people who would carry it furthest. Eleanor was 26 years old, and she did not intend to give way. She had married Aldermere at 19, a country attorney's daughter lifted into a rank she had not been raised to wear, and she had spent 7 years learning the cost of a coronet. She knew which families would cut her if she stumbled. She knew that the same women who curtsied to her title would happily watch her lose it. She had no illusions about the affection of the season. What she had instead was the memory of her husband at the end, his hand thin in hers, telling her to look after the people of Aldermere, the tenants and the servants and the small school he had built in the village, because the nephew never would. She had promised him. A promise made to a dying man is a particular kind of debt, and Eleanor paid her debts. She had sat with him through the 4 days of the fever, sponging his brow and reading aloud from the books he could no longer hold. And on the last evening when his voice had gone to a thread, he had made her swear it twice, that the village would not suffer for his dying, that the school would keep its doors, and the old people their roofs. She had sworn. She had meant it then in the way one means anything beside a deathbed, and she had learned since that keeping such a promise cost a great deal more than making it, and that the people who watched a widow most closely were precisely the people least likely to understand why she would beggar her own jewel case to keep a roof over strangers. That was why the jewels were gone. The roof of the village almshouse had failed in September, and the winter was coming hard, and the estate's ready money was tied in a dozen knots that Crispin's solicitors had helped to tie. So she had taken the Aldermere diamonds, the parure that had been worn by 4 duchesses before her, and she had sold them quietly through a jeweler in town, and she had put the almshouse right before the first frost. 11 families would be dry and warm by Christmas. The jewels were the price, and she had not hesitated over it for a single hour. She had told no one. To explain it would be to invite Crispin's solicitors to call it mismanagement, proof that the widow was selling the family heritage, and so she had let the room believe whatever the room wished to believe. On the night of the gala, the room wished to believe she was ruined. The man at the window was Julian Hartley, the Duke of Ravensmere, and he was the one person in England the season had given up trying to read. He was 34, dark and spare, with a face that gave away nothing, and a reputation built entirely of withdrawals. He did not dance. He did not court. He had buried a wife 5 years before, and had not been seen to smile since, and the great houses had long ago filed him under the heading of Men One, invited for the consequence of his name, and did not expect to enliven the evening. He came to the Whitmore Gala because his sister chaired its committee, and because absence would have been its own kind of statement. He had meant to stay an hour. He had been watching the doors without admitting to himself that he was watching them, and when the gray silk came through, he forgot, for the length of a breath, the careful arithmetic by which he kept himself apart from rooms like this one. He had met the Duchess of Aldermere twice before, both times briefly, both times in passing, and both times he had carried away from the encounter the uncomfortable sense of having been seen more clearly than he wished. She did not flatter him. She did not angle for his attention the way the ambitious mothers angled their daughters. She had once at a dinner contradicted him on a point of estate drainage, correctly, in front of 6 people, and had then changed the subject to spare him the correction's full weight, and he had thought about it for a week. Now she was crossing a hostile room with her chin level, and her hands bare, and the hostility was so plain that he felt it in his own chest like a draught from an opened door. The first cruelty of the evening came quickly. Lady Brixham, who had appointed herself the season's keeper of accounts, rose from her seat as Eleanor passed and performed a small theater of concern that is the cruelest weapon in a drawing-room. She caught Eleanor's bare hand in both of hers and held it up, just slightly, just enough that the candlelight could confirm to everyone nearby that there was no ring of consequence upon it. And she said how brave it was, how very brave, to come out at all in such reduced circumstances. The word reduced did its work. Heads turned. A young woman in pink, Miss Augusta Brixham, the lady's niece and the acknowledged diamond of the season, lifted her own jeweled wrist to her mouth to hide a smile that was not hidden at all. Eleanor withdrew her hand without haste. She thanked the dowager for her kindness in a voice so level that the kindness curdled in the saying of it, and she moved on, and only a person standing very close would have seen the pulse beating hard in the soft hollow of her throat. The crowd nearest the orchestra had heard the word and passed it along. Reduced, reduced, the way a stone passes hand to hand. And Eleanor felt it follow her down the length of the room, attaching itself to her bare wrists and her plain gray silk, settling over her like a verdict the season had been waiting all autumn to deliver. She had known they would say something. She had dressed that morning, knowing it, choosing the gray deliberately, refusing to borrow against a future she meant to keep. Knowing a blow is coming does not soften it. It only means you do not flinch. Julian was not standing close. He was the length of the ballroom away, and yet he saw the throat, the pulse, the small betrayal of a body, holding itself together by will alone, and something in him that had been asleep for 5 years turned over and woke. He set down the glass he had not been drinking from. He did not yet cross the room. A man who has spent 5 years learning not to want does not unlearn it in an instant. He watched her find a place near the cold windows apart from the dancing, and he watched the season arrange its opinion of her into a settled thing, and he found that he could not return his attention to the careful nothing he had been attending to all evening. The dancing went on. Eleanor stood at the edge of it, and the edge of a ballroom is a particular country, populated by chaperones and dowagers and the unmarriageable, and she had not expected to find herself a citizen of it so soon. She watched Augusta Brixton take the floor with the Viscount's son, the girl's diamonds throwing light with every turn, and she felt the old wound stir, the one her husband's death had reopened and Crispin's campaign had salted. The wound was not vanity. Eleanor had never greatly cared for diamonds. The wound was older and went deeper. It was the conviction, planted in girlhood and watered by every season since, that she was a borrowed thing in this world, an attorney's daughter playing at a rank that would be taken back the moment she faltered, and that no one in any glittering room would ever choose her for herself once the title and the house were gone. Her husband had chosen her. Her husband was dead now, and the chooser she had relied upon was a memory now, and the room had decided she was reduced. She did not weep. She had learned long ago that the season fed on visible distress, and she would not feed it. Instead, she did what she always did when a room turned against her. She found someone smaller than herself to be kind to. There was a child at the gala, which was unusual. Ravensmere had brought his late wife's daughter, a girl of 7 named Sophie, because the child had been ill and clinging, and the nursemaid was new, and the sister who chaired the committee had insisted the air would do her good. Sophie had been deposited in an anteroom off the ballroom with a plate of sweets and a footman who plainly did not know what to do with her, and she had escaped as ill and clinging children do, and had found her way to the cold windows where a quiet lady in grey was standing alone. The child was crying very softly, the boneless, exhausted crying of a feverish night, and the footman had lost her, and the season swept past the small disaster without seeing it at all. Eleanor saw it. She knelt down in her riverstone gown on the polished floor, heedless of the silk, and she gathered the child against her, and asked her name in a low voice. And when Sophie could not stop crying, Eleanor did not tell her to stop. She told her a story instead. It was a foolish story about a fox who lived under the steps of a great house and stole one glove from every guest who came to dance, and she told it badly and warmly, inventing as she went. And the child's sobs slowed and caught and turned by degrees into the hiccuping attention of a tired girl being told that the world contained foxes and stolen gloves and that someone had stopped to notice her. Eleanor took her own gray shawl from her shoulders and wrapped it around the small, shaking body, and she stayed there on the floor, in the draught from the winter windows, holding a stranger's child, while the gala turned and glittered behind her. She did not know that the child's father had crossed half the room. Julian stopped a few feet away, in the shadow between 2 candle stands, and he watched the Duchess of Aldermere kneel on a cold floor and give her shawl to his daughter, and he did not announce himself. He had spent 5 years believing that Sophie was beyond his reach, that the grief which had taken his wife had also taken his capacity to comfort the living, that the child flinched from him because he was made of stone and could not help it. He had tried gifts and governesses and the best physicians in London. He had never once managed to tell her a story about a fox. And here was a woman the whole room had just declared ruined, kneeling in her good gown, doing the one thing he had not been able to do, asking nothing, not knowing she was watched. The arithmetic by which he kept himself apart failed him completely. He stood in the shadow and felt his own face change, and was glad no one could see it. When at last the new nursemaid came, hurrying, full of apology, Eleanor surrendered the child gently, and rose, and only then did she see the man standing in the shadow, and only then did she understand that the whole of it had been witnessed. She expected coldness. The Duke of Ravensmere was famous for it. Instead, he looked at her with an expression she could not read, and he said, in a low, even voice, that she was kind to a child who was not her own. It was not quite a compliment. It was something heavier and stranger, a statement laid down like a stone. And Eleanor, who could parry any compliment in the season's arsenal, found she had no defense against being simply seen. She said the child had needed only a story. He said that he had not been able to give her one. The admission cost him visibly, a man unused to confessing any incapacity, and Eleanor felt the floor of the conversation shift beneath them both. That was the first of it. Across the weeks that followed, the Duke of Ravensmere began to appear where the Duchess of Aldemere was, and he did it so quietly that she did not at first trust it, and the season did not at first believe it. He called at the house in town on a thin pretext concerning a parish matter their estates shared, and stayed an hour, and said little. He was at the Hartwell musicale, standing again apart, and when Crispin Vane cornered Eleanor near the refreshment table, and spoke to her in the low, pressing tone he used to remind her of her precariousness, Julian crossed the room without apparent hurry and stood at her elbow and said only that the Duchess had promised him her opinion, which was a lie, and Crispin, who had no rank with which to contest a duke's claim on a lady's conversation, withdrew. Eleanor had not asked for the rescue. She was not sure she wanted it. She noticed, though, that her pulse had steadied the moment he arrived, and she distrusted the steadying more than she had distrusted the fear. He did not court her in any way the season would recognize. He gave no compliments. He sent no flowers. What he did instead was issue small, flat commands that she came slowly to understand were a language she had not been taught to read. At a chilly garden party, he said, "Come inside, you are cold." And she had not realized she was cold until he named it. At a dinner where the Dowager had arranged the seating to leave Eleanor stranded among the dullest guests, Julian said to his hostess, "The Duchess of Aldemere will sit by me. I have a question for her about drainage," and the table rearranged itself around his rank. And Eleanor spent the dinner being asked careful questions about her tenants by a man who actually listened to the answers. He wanted to know how many families the school served, and whether the new master was a good one, and what the winter wheat had done in the wet autumn, and he asked the way a man asks who intends to do something with the answer, rather than merely fill the air between courses. She found herself talking more than she had talked in months, talking the way she had used to talk with her husband, plainly and about real things. And partway through the second course she realized that the dullness the Dowager had arranged for her had been quietly undone, and that the woman at the head of the table was watching the rearrangement with a fan held a half-inch too high and an expression that could not decide whether to be scandalized or afraid. "Sit down," he said when she had been on her feet too long at a crowded reception. "Eat something," he said, when she had been too anxious in Crispin's presence to manage the supper. She heard the commands as coldness, the bluntness of a man who did not know how to be otherwise. The truth, which the watching listener understood long before she did, was that every command was a small act of shelter, the only way a man made of stone knew how to put his body between a woman and the cold. Her own body had begun to answer him in ways she could not govern. She would be standing in a crowded room with her back to the door, attending to a conversation, and she would know the instant he entered, know it in her spine and the backs of her hands before any voice announced him, and she would have to school her face into stillness so that no one might read what her blood had already confessed. When he stood near her, she was aware of exactly the distance between his sleeve and hers, the precise number of inches of cold air, and she resented her own awareness, because awareness was hope, and hope was the thing she could least afford. She had been chosen once. She did not believe the world gave a woman like her two choosings, and yet her hand, when he was near, would steady itself on the back of a chair as though the chair could explain to her why she could not breathe. She caught herself more than once arranging her route across a crowded room so that it would carry her within speaking distance of wherever he stood, and then despising herself for the arranging, and doing it again the following evening. She had spent 7 years as a duchess learning to want nothing she could not be certain of keeping, and here was a wanting she could not govern at all, a wanting with no guarantee attached, and it frightened her more than Crispin's solicitors and the Dowager's fan together. A woman with a house to lose could not afford to lose her head as well. She told herself this firmly, and her body did not listen to a word of it. Midway through that strange autumn, on a gray afternoon, when the parish business had brought him again to her drawing-room, and the rain had kept him past the polite hour, Eleanor learned why the Duke of Ravensmere was made of stone. She had asked him gently about the child, about Sophie, about why a man so plainly capable of love stood so far from his own daughter. He was quiet for a long moment and the rain ran down the windows. And then he told her in the flat, level voice he used for the things that mattered most, that he had not been at home when his wife died. He had been in London, on business he could not now even remember the substance of, business that had seemed urgent and was not, and Clara had taken a fever, the same swift autumn fever that took so many, and by the time the rider reached him and he reached home, she was 3 hours gone. Sophie had been 2 years old. She had been in the house when her mother died and her father was away, and Julian had spent 5 years certain that the child's flinching was a verdict that she knew, in the way small children know things without words, that he had not been there, that he chose business over her mother's last breath. He had stopped trying to reach her because he believed he had forfeited the right. He carried a small thing always in the breast pocket of his coat, and as he spoke, his hand went to it without his seeming to know. A worn miniature of Clara that he had not been able to put away and could not bear to look at. He named the wound once, plainly, and then he stopped, and the room was silent. But for the rain, and Eleanor did not reach for him, though every nerve in her body bent toward it. She only said that a child of 7 does not keep accounts, and that he had been there for 5 years since, every day, even when the child could not yet feel it. He looked at her as though she had said something in a language he had spent 5 years failing to translate. He did not answer at once. He turned the small miniature once in his fingers, the gilt edge worn smooth by 5 years of a thumb that could not leave it alone, and he said that he had told no one. This, not his sister, not the physicians, not the long succession of governesses who had come and gone, and that he did not know why he had told her. Eleanor said that some things were lighter for being set down once in a quiet room with the rain on the glass. He said that perhaps they were. The fire settled. Outside, the afternoon went gray to slate, and neither of them rose to call for candles, as though candlelight would end a thing that needed the dimness to be spoken at all. That was the turn, though neither of them named it so. After the rain afternoon, the season's machinery began to grind faster, because Crispin had not been idle while the Duke distracted his quarry. He had found, in the tangle of the Aldermere accounts, the sale of the diamonds. He did not know where the money had gone. He did not care. He understood only that the widowed Duchess had sold the family parure without the consent of the heir presumptive, and he understood that in the right room, said the right way, this could finish her. A widow who sold the heritage was no longer a tragic figure to be pitied. She was a profligate to be managed, a woman who could not be trusted with the estate, and Crispin meant to say it where it would do the most damage. He chose the Ravensmere ball. It was the Duke's sister who hosted the ball, a great crush at the close of the season. And all the world came, and the irony that Crispin chose Julian's own house for the killing stroke was lost on him entirely. He did not know what had grown between the Duke and the widow. He knew only that the Ravensmere ball was the most watched event of the autumn, and that an accusation made there would travel everywhere by morning. He waited until the floor was full and the candles were at their height, and then he raised his voice. Not into a shout, but into the carrying pitch of a man who wishes to be overheard by hundreds, and he asked the Duchess of Aldermere across the suddenly attentive room whether she would care to tell the company what had become of the Aldermere diamonds. Whether she would care to explain why a parure worn by 4 duchesses had passed through a jeweler's hands in town. Whether the heritage of a great house was hers to sell. The room went, still in the way a room goes, still when it scents a fall. The dowager's fans stopped. Augusta, in diamonds, drew a small breath of anticipation, and Eleanor stood alone in the center of the floor she had not chosen to occupy, and felt the whole weight of the season's verdict gather itself to descend. She could have lied. She could have named the almshouse and the 11 families and the failed roof, and turned the room's contempt to admiration in a sentence. To do that, though, was to make a public coin of her husband's tenants, to parade the village poor as a defense, to let Crispin's vulgarity drag the dignity of those families into a ballroom, for the season to coo over, and she would not do it. She had not given the diamonds to be applauded. She lifted her chin, and she said in a clear voice that did not shake, that the disposition of her own jewels was her own affair, and that she owed the company no account of it. It was the truth. It was also, in that room, an admission of guilt, and she knew it as she said it, and she said it anyway. The murmur rose. Crispin smiled, because to the room she had just confirmed everything. If this moment is sitting in your chest the way it sits in mine, you already know the season had not heard the last word, it had only heard the first. For a long moment the Duke did nothing, and the not doing was the worst thing Eleanor had ever felt, worse than the Dowager's hand, worse than Crispin's voice, because she had let herself hope, and hope was now exacting its price in full. She did not look at Julian. She could not.
What?
She fixed her eyes on the middle distance and prepared to walk out of his sister's ballroom with whatever dignity the season had left her, and she told herself that she had always known the world did not give a woman like her two choosings. Then the Duke of Ravensmere crossed the floor. He did not hurry. He came through the parted crowd in his dark coat, with his face giving nothing away, and the room watched him come, and Crispin's smile began to falter at the edges as a duke he had not accounted for bore down upon the center of his triumph. Julian stopped beside Eleanor, closer than propriety strictly allowed, and he turned to face the room rather than her. And he let the silence stretch until it was complete, until 300 people had stopped breathing to hear what he would say. He had in his hand a folded paper, and the listener who had watched his hand go so often to his breast pocket might have guessed what it was, though the room could not. It was a letter from the vicar of Aldermere, sent to the Duke a week before, on the parish business that had been his pretext all autumn, and it named in the vicar's plain, grateful hand the lady who had sold her diamonds to Ruth the almshouse, and had asked that no one be told. Julian had known for a week he had said nothing because it had not been his to tell. It was hers. She had chosen silence over self-defense instead, and so he made the only choice the moment left him. He said, his voice level and carrying to every corner of the stilled room 6 words that ended the matter entirely. I am going to marry her. He did not raise his voice to say it. He did not need to. The 6 words went out into the stilled room in the same level tone he might have used to remark upon the weather, and that was what made them land with such weight that a man famous for wanting nothing had just said plainly in front of 300 people the one thing no one had ever expected to hear from him. The silence held for one full beat, and then the room broke, not into uproar, into the small sounds of a verdict reversing itself all at once. The indrawn breaths, the turned heads, the rustle of 300 people rearranging in an instant everything they had decided to believe. The Dowager's fan slipped from her fingers and struck the floor. Augusta's face beneath its diamonds went white, and then carefully blank. Crispin stood at the center of his ruined accusation, with his mouth slightly open, and he looked, for the first time all autumn, like exactly what he was, a young man of modest income who had wagered everything on a widow's friendlessness and had just discovered she was not friendless at all. Julian had not finished. He turned and laid the vicar's letter in the hand of his sister the hostess, and asked her quietly to read it aloud, and she did, in the ringing, clear voice of a woman who loved her brother and had been waiting all season to see him return from the dead. The almshouse, the failed roof, the 11 families, the diamonds sold to keep them warm, and the request that no one be told. The room heard it in total silence, and the silence by the end was a different kind entirely, the silence of a crowd, ashamed of the thing it had so eagerly believed. Eleanor had not moved through any of it. She stood very still beside the man who had just claimed her in front of the entire season, and she found that her composure, which had survived the Dowager and Crispin and 11 months of small daily cruelty, would not survive being seen. Her eyes filled. She did not let the tears fall, but she could not stop them gathering. And Julian, without looking at her, without any change in his still face, moved his hand the smallest distance until the back of it rested against the back of hers. The only touch he could decently offer in that room, and it was enough. It was everything. The crowd was already turning Crispin out of its attention, the way a tide turns a thing back up the beach, and a senior peer near the door, the old Earl of Penhallow who had known her husband, said clearly that Aldermere had chosen his Duchess well, and that any man who said otherwise might say it to him, and that closed the procedural door for good. Crispin would press no claim. Now no solicitor in England would take the case of a man the season had watched be wrong. So publicly, the estate was hers, the promise to her husband was kept, and the Duke of Ravensmere had crossed a ballroom and ended it in 6 words, and would not, the listener may be assured, take a single one of them back. The wedding was small, by the standards of 2 great houses. They married in the village church at Aldermere in the first week of December, with snow coming down soft and steady on the grey stone, and the 11 families from the almshouse stood at the back in their best dry and warm, and the school Aldermere had built sent its children to line the path with no jewels among them and no need of any. Sophie carried the flowers. She had begun in the weeks since the ball to reach for her father's hand without being prompted. A small change. He noticed each time with the wonder of a man who had stopped expecting to be reached for. And on the wedding morning she fell asleep against his shoulder in the carriage, and he sat without moving for the whole of the journey, rather than wake her. In the evening, when the guests had gone and the snow had thickened against the windows, the 3 of them sat together in the small, warm sitting room that Eleanor loved best in all the house, the one with the worn chairs and the fire that never quite drew straight. Julian had taken the miniature of Clara from his breast pocket at last, not to put it away, but to set it where it belonged, on the mantel above the fire, where Sophie could see her mother's face whenever she wished. And Eleanor had understood, without being told, that this was a man laying down a weight he had carried for 5 years. The child slept on the hearthrug with the grey shawl over her, the same shawl from the gala, which Sophie had refused to give back, and which had become hers by the unarguable logic of children. The fire ticked, and the chimney drew its crooked draught, and somewhere in the house a clock that had counted out her husband's last hours counted now a wholly different kind of evening. The snow came down on the windows of a house that was past all the season's expectation, securely and warmly her own. She thought of the 11 families in the almshouse with their new roof, settling to their own fires on the same cold night, and she did not regret the diamonds for a single moment. Not the loss of them, and not the manner of it. The public shame turned in an instant to the public truth. Eleanor sat with her bare hands open in her lap, ringless, still but for the plain new band, wearing no jewels and needing none, and watched the firelight move on her husband's quiet face and her daughter's sleeping one, and thought that the room at the gala had been right about one thing only. She had indeed had nothing left to pin to herself. She had given it all away, and in the giving had been found, and had been chosen, and had come at last into a home that no solicitor could draft away, and no fan could whisper down. The fox under the steps, she thought, with the ghost of a smile, had stolen the right glove, after all. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. If Eleanor's story warmed you, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you. And may your own winter be a warm one.